Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for March 5th, 2021. Well, it is March 5th, and for those of you who thought you were going to wake up today and find out that there was a military coup that took place yesterday, that President Trump was put back into the White House, that Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, and all the others were rounded up and sent to prison, it didn't happen. The fact that Q and a number of others promised this would, they're now saying, well, the time is not yet ripe, it's going to take place later. It's obviously time to give up these kinds of wishful fantasies. What has to happen is Americans have to start thinking on a higher strategic level so that we're not fooled by the vague promises or the lying promises of politicians and the corrupt cabals that run the country, but that we actually take into our own hands the fight to make policy that will strengthen our country, that will overcome the economic crisis, the collapse, and the war danger. Look, we face an extremely serious situation that we have to address. Let's start with the global financial collapse. We're heading toward a period where there could be a domino-style collapse of financial instruments, financial derivatives. Trillions of dollars backed by nothing could disappear in a puff of smoke overnight. Or we could have a Weimar-style hyperinflation as the Federal Reserve continues to pump worthless money into the financial system in the vague hope that they can continue to roll over the debt until they can get a green financial bubble in place to have a whole new bubble of $30 to $40 trillion to spend. That's the Great Reset. That's the Green New Deal. That has to be defeated because that would, if it's carried out, would spell the end of the human race as we know it. Now, also threatening the human race as we know it is a war danger. We saw yesterday Biden's defense, or his Secretary of State, Blinken, issue a threat to China, that the Chinese are aggressive, they're a major threat to us, and we have to prepare for that. There's a move to extend NATO to encircle China as part of a containment operation. There's talk of escalating the U.S. presence in the region, also the NATO presence in the Indo-Pacific region. And along with that, there's discussion going on of a nuclear arms buildup. All of this is extremely dangerous. There's a prospect of another strike in Syria or Iraq based on the continued threats coming from so-called terrorist operations in the region. You also have Israeli strikes on Syria and Israeli threats against Iran. And at the same time, there are millions of people, including large numbers of children, starving in Yemen as a result of the Saudi war against that country. You have similarly starvation in Syria, a country that was almost a breadbasket for many years in the Middle East, but through the ravages of war, the deployment of terrorist operations, there are whole parts of the country that are cut off from the center, and people face starvation there. Now, with these kinds of threats, what can we do? And the first question I have is, how can we move the supporters of Trump, as well as those who were foolishly supporting Biden in the last election, who are also suffering from the economic crisis? How can we create a mobilization to change this? Now, we have the program, LaRouche's Four-Power Agreement, which would have a cooperation among sovereign nation states, the United States, Russia, and China in particular, to prevent the Great Reset from taking place, to take power away from the central banks, take power away from the private financial institutions and their corporate cartels, and put it back into the hands of national sovereign governments who act in the interests of their people. That's the solution. And the economic program that would work is LaRouche's 4 laws. Re-regulation of banking along the lines of Glass-Steagall. No more bailouts, no bail-ins. Speculators have to eat their own losses. That's the first step. A major investment through a Hamiltonian credit system, as opposed to a Federal Reserve, a privately controlled Federal Reserve, but a national bank with a credit policy modeled on that of Alexander Hamilton, which built our nation, is the second law. Third law, massive investment in building new platforms of infrastructure, which are vitally needed in the United States. And the fourth point is channel much of the, or a certain portion, I should say, of the investment, maybe 5–10% of that, according to LaRouche's proposal, into frontiers of science and technology, advanced research in nuclear fusion, plasma physics, and space exploration, where the investment of credit will have tremendous returns in the private sector contracts related to it. Those four laws, done in conjunction with collaboration of the great strategic powers, the United States, Russia, and China, would break the back of the speculators who presently are running the system through their control with campaign contributions, their think tanks, their control of the media, their censorship. It would break the back of that. Now, how do we get there? That's the question. Well, this is where we have to change the strategic thinking. Americans are being played once again as suckers. We had a 30-something, 40-year Cold War where we were convinced that the Soviet Union was the great threat to us. And in some cases they were. But what John Kennedy showed in diffusing the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what Reagan showed in his discussions with Gorbachev, is that we could reach agreements where we could minimize the danger of war, and possibly, had Reagan been able to follow through with LaRouche's proposal for the SDI, which he supported, had we shared that with Russia, we could have had a totally different outcome to the end of the Cold War, in which we would have helped Russia rebuild its nation, and Russia would have restored its dignity as opposed to being looted. Had that happened, we could have had a completely different situation in the last 30 years instead of careening toward a new Cold War with hot spots everywhere. So people have to come to terms with the fact that the reason that didn't happen was the same crew that's responsible for the terrible trade deals, for the Green New Deal, and for the regional endless wars. They're still controlling the agenda. But they're weak. We have to figure out a way to communicate to enough people that we have to break the power of this network. Now, how do you do that? I mean, there are all sorts of things. You can have local actions where you reclaim the voting process. This from the preliminary reading of this vote, the Voting Rights Act that passed the House yesterday, is a catastrophe. It has nothing to do with guaranteeing voters' rights, but guarantees the right of people who want to control the election to continue to control it. But we have to take action on that front. But most important, we have to change the thinking of the average American, away from the idea of being a victim of uncontrollable circumstances, which leads some to wishful thinking that perhaps a gang of good guys in white hats are going to ride over the horizon and throw all the bad guys into Guantanamo. It didn't happen. It's not going to happen. We have to be the good guys, which means we have to educate in a very loving way a large section of the population to understand who's really oppressing them. That their biggest problem isn't their boss or the people that don't look like them that live next door or down the street, but their biggest problem is this gang of criminals who are part of the banker cabal who are running the country. Use our material to strengthen your own understanding of this and to go out and organize others. Get them to watch our videos. But this is an educational process. Many people have been educated the last 4 years to know that there is a criminal cabal out there. The question is, how do you break their back? The criminal cabal is not China. It's not Iran. It's New York, Wall Street, it's the Silicon Valley, and it's the city of London. And once people get that and realize that these are the people who are running the Congress and running the banking system and running the big pharma and so on, once people realize that the assertion of citizens' rights through our institutions of self-government is the solution, then we can make some progress in that direction. Now, the second question was, and by the way, we need a cultural renaissance. The current culture, the cancel culture, the rock, sex, drug culture, which is now not the counterculture anymore, but is the actual culture, that has to be changed. There are ways to do that, and this is one of the reasons the Schiller Institute emphasizes culture as a major part of our program, giving people a capability to think on the higher level of the great artists, the composers, the builders in the past, the scientists. That's the way you change the way people think about themselves, their neighbors, and the world. Now, one of the questions that came up is, what about the transaction tax that Lyndon had proposed years ago on Wall Street? Is that still a valid proposition? Well, at the time, and this was during the speculative bubble in mortgage-backed securities and so on, Lyndon LaRouche proposed a transaction tax, which other people picked up on. The idea that every time something of questionable financial value is bought and sold, there's a tax attached to it to take away some of the profit of churning these worthless instruments. But at this point, the whole system has gone kablooey. A transaction tax might provide a little bit of money, but that's not the solution. You don't solve a problem like that with taxation. You solve it with regulation, and you solve it with an investment credit policy that channels funds toward real production and away from the financial sector. The problem we have is the money sector, the financial sector, the belief in money as wealth, as opposed to the understanding that it's productive value that determines whether a society can function or not. So I would say that the time for a transaction tax has probably passed us by. We have to go to more fundamental, radical, transformational measures, going back to Glass-Steagall, a national credit policy, taking power away from the Federal Reserve, which means taking it away from the shadow banking system. But the idea was valid at the time. I think times have changed. Now, finally, there's a question, what's going on in this tension in the Horn of Africa between Eritrea and Ethiopia? I have to tell you, I don't have all the answers on this except one simple one. The Chinese have moved into Africa in a very aggressive way with the Belt and Road Initiative, not to establish military domination, but to alleviate poverty the same way the Chinese have alleviated poverty for 800 million of their people, which is building, which is engagement in physical productivity, which includes power, it includes water management, it includes transportation, it includes education, it includes healthcare. All of these things are vitally needed, not just in Africa, but for upgrades throughout the whole world. We need that in the United States. But the Chinese are going into Africa, areas of Africa, to work with nations, not to indebt them. They're already indebted by the International Monetary Fund system that has continued a colonial policy against Africa for the last 50 years. Now, they're going in to give people the means to build their own economies, to produce goods, to use their raw materials in their own countries so that they can develop real wealth to escape the colonial bind they've been in for hundreds of years. That's what the Chinese are doing. Now, there are people who don't like that, namely the international bankers, namely the criminal cabal of Wall Street and the City of London and the International Monetary Fund. And they pull strings. There's conflict over the dam that's being built there. There's conflict over who's going to benefit from the transportation and so on. And it's not that difficult to stir countries up against each other if they're taken away from this view of a common purpose. That's what geopolitics is. That's what the whole British strategy is for dominating the world. Pit nations against each other where they have a fight over what they consider scarce resources, such as water and so on, so that they'll fight over that as opposed to creating continent-wide solutions that then plug into transcontinental programs that are supracontinental programs, such as the Belt and Road Initiative. So that's the same fight. So I don't know all the details, and I'll see if I can find more for next week's questions. But that's, I think, what we're dealing with, a world in which British geopolitics and neoliberalism are still dominant. Too many people believe in money as a solution. Too many people believe you have to have an enemy. If we can break from that, the potential for a new paradigm is boundless and would free us to take on the real tasks that human beings have before us of discovering what the true potential of mankind is. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back with you next week.